Welcome to your second chess lesson. In this lesson, I'll introduce to you the chess pawns. Okay? This is what a white pawn looks like, and this is what the black pawn looks like. When we start out a chess game, we actually have 8 of them lined up, and I'm going to show that in a moment how. But before that, I'm going to show you what you do with the pawns. How do you move with them? What the purpose of the pawn is. So let's say a white pawn starts out on the d2 square, which you already learned about in the first lesson, right? The names of the squares. A pawn always moves forward, right? So you can move it 1 square up or 2 squares up. However, you can only do that in its very first move. Once you moved it 1 or 2, after that you can only move 1 square forward at a time. Now, the pawn is a tricky piece because it captures differently than how it moves. So, let's suppose there are some black pawns around it. The pawn cannot capture like that. You cannot do that. However, you capture diagonally to the side. That's how a pawn captures. Okay. What else to know about the pawn? The pawn never, ever can move backwards. That's really important and really different from all the other pieces that you will learn about. Now, the pawn is also unique because it's the only piece that can transform to be a different piece. In fact, almost any piece except for the king. But you can become a knight, a rook, a bishop, or a queen. So it's very, very special. How do you do that? When the pawn runs forward and reaches all the way to the other side of the board, if it's a white pawn, the 8th rank, or if it was a black pawn, then it's the 1st rank, and you replace your pawn by a queen, which we'll learn about later. So, the pawn is very special, and in the beginning of the game, the white pawns start right here, all along the 2nd rank, while the black pawns start right here on the 7th rank. And now, you're ready to play some pawn wars also. But before that, I suggest you listen further in the lesson and listen to our digital board and the instructions and more details about pawns. So, this is what the pawns look like. Welcome to the world of pawns. As you can see, white has a pawn on which square? Hopefully you remember from the previous lesson. That square is called E3 for white, and the black pawn is right now on C7. Okay, great. So, we have 8 of those little pawns in a chess game when we start out. Each side. White has 8 pawns and so does black. All of the pawns start on the 2nd rank. Well, for white it's called 2nd rank, but for black it is the 7th rank. Okay, let's learn about how the pawns move. So, pawns have a lot of little things about them that are different than any of the other pieces. The pawns, when they start out, they have special privileges. Because normally, throughout the game, pawns can only always move 1 square forward. That's it. 1 square forward at the time. However, when a pawn is just starting out, and that's each of the pawns individually, independently, they each can choose, do I want to move 1 square forward, or do I want to move 2 squares forward? So, white can choose here to move up 2 squares, or alternatively can choose to move up just 1. One very important thing to remember about pawns. Pawns, unlike all the other chess pieces that you will learn about, they never, ever move backwards. So that's why you often have to be careful and think about it twice. Do you really want to move 2 squares up? Or maybe you should be more cautious and just move 1 up. So in a situation like this, when there is nothing, no enemy piece in your pawn's way, generally, you would want to move up as fast as you can and therefore move up 2 squares. The same for the other side. Black also normally would prefer to move up 2 squares. But let's see what happens when the pawn only moves up 1 square. Instead of 2, it moves only 1. From now on, whether the pawn moved 1 or 2 squares, for the rest of the game, these pawns, right? Like for white, the F pawn, and for black, the C pawn. Well, on our current board, those are the only pawns we have. But even if we have all the other pawns, these particular pawns on these files will only be able to move 1 square forward at a time. Okay? So white, let's say, could move to F5, and then black would move to C5, and F6, and C4, and so on. Now, let me show you another unique thing about pawns that's different from all the other chess pieces. Pawns capture differently than they move. Okay, so we already learned that when a pawn moves, doesn't capture, but moves, it's always only forward, normally only 1 square ahead. Only when the pawn is on the second rank, only then the pawn may have the option to choose between moving 1 or 2 squares forward. Now, the pawn captures diagonally. So basically the square immediately diagonally the first square. So right now, white has the option to capture the pawn on D5. So there is only one legal capture here for black, and that is capturing the pawn on B3. So if we go back to this position we were looking at, white on the other hand would have 2 options, right? Either capture the pawn we already saw, with pawn takes on D5, or white could also capture the A4 pawn just like this with the pawn. Okay, let's move on. And let's see another special privilege that pawns have. Pawns, unlike any of the other pieces, later in the game, when they reach all the way across the board, they can become any piece they choose except for a king, nor can they remain a pawn. Okay? So when the pawn advances 1 step at a time, right, and finally reaches all the way to the promotion square, as you can see, white now can choose. You will learn later about the other pieces, but basically white can choose any of them. As you learn later, the queen is usually the most wanted because it's the most valuable of all the pieces. So the pawn would disappear and a queen would appear in its place. So, back to all the pawns, each side having 8 of them. It means, now that you know the rules, you're ready for the pawn wars. Have fun! Welcome to lesson 3. Now we're gonna learn some more about pawns. As you already know, pawns do a lot of things differently than other pieces. So there is a lot to learn about them. And the big new thing we're learning in this lesson is about en passant. That's a French word, which basically means you're capturing while moving, which is very unusual. And let me demonstrate that. We already know that the pawns, only when they start out in their initial positions, can choose to move up 1 or 2 squares. So, when the white pawn chooses to move up not 1, but 2 squares, which each of the pawns can only do from their initial position once in a game, right? So each of the pawns, this one, this one, this one, this one, right? So they each have that option. So this pawn could move here, this pawn could move here. Of course, this pawn at the moment cannot, while a black pawn is there, right? So let's suppose the e pawn moves up to e4 for white. Now, black has this very special opportunity that's called en passant, when a pawn can move behind the e4 pawn and take it off. Right? Normally, that's not how we capture. However, there is this special situation that sometimes arises during a chess game. Also, by the way, when the pawn moved up to e4, the other pawn, the f pawn, can also do the same en passant. Or, had white played with a c pawn to c4, since there is a pawn on one side of it, or if there would be a b4, could do the same. But for now, the d pawn can move behind it and capture it. Okay? I know that a lot of beginner players don't yet play with en passant, but I want you to be aware of it, not to be shocked when one of the other opponents you play will know it and tries to do it, and I don't want you to argue with him or her that there isn't such a move. Yes, there is, but in the beginning you can choose to play with the en passant rule or without. So that's the most important thing to learn about en passant. And now please check out the rest of the chapter with the digital content. And now let me introduce to you some cool pawn tricks. As we already know, generally the pawn's aim is to get all the way across and get promoted to a more valuable piece, which typically is a queen. However, in order to create a passed pawn, as we call it, we have to make sure there is no enemy pawn in its way, and neither is there an enemy pawn on either side of it that would capture our pawn. Unless, of course, if we have support from one of our other pawns. So in this case, white is able to create a passed pawn by advancing to f5. Black, for example, plays c6 and now f6. Now this is where it's really important that we do have a pawn on e5 that's highlighted with green. So after black captures our pawn, we are able to recapture, right? And then our pawn will be first to get across the board and promote to a queen. Let's look at the next example, where you will learn about something new that's called breakthrough. So again, remember, our target in this pawn wars is to get any one of our pawns across, and that means we win the game, right? This is a mini game, the pawn war. So it doesn't matter if we lose a pawn or two along the way, as long as one of our pawns gets across before our opponent does. So here we'll see one of those examples where white sacrifices one pawn in order for the d pawn to get across. So c6, now the pawn is aiming to either capture the black pawn on d7 or just simply move forward to get promoted. And after black captures our pawn, the path of the d pawn is clear and it will promote very quickly. And now let's see a much trickier version of this same idea when we don't mind losing a pawn or two, as long as the third one will get across to promote. So this is a very famous chess puzzle that happens actually a lot also in real chess games. So, as we said, we don't care which pawn gets across as long as one of them does. So you can try to figure this out, play around with it, and see if you can succeed. So white can try to push any of the three pawns, but only one of them really works. So let's try pushing the c pawn. Here, unfortunately, black can capture our pawn and then push the a pawn, and now none of the pawns can move, so we're having a tie, we're having a draw. Going back to the beginning, if we try to push the other pawn, black has an option to do the same, capture, capture, and c6, or even can push through and then capture with the c pawn, and again, white cannot make any move, cannot make progress. So that leaves us with the only correct choice, and that is to push the middle pawn. Okay? So now Black has choices, whether capture with the A7 pawn or the C7 pawn. Otherwise, white will capture one of those black pawns and being just one rank away from promoting. So, if the C pawn captures, we sacrifice one more pawn by playing A6. Now, if B pawn takes to C5, we capture the B7 pawn and white arrived first. Of course, the pawn doesn't remain a pawn. It will become another piece, most likely a queen. If after A6, black rather captures on A6, then we advance our C pawn, and as we can see, the white pawn arrives much quicker than its black counterpart. Finally, after B6, if black chooses to take with the A7 pawn, then we're giving up our C pawn next, threatening to capture the pawn on B7, and if B takes C6, we're advancing the A pawn, and again, white arrived first. So, hopefully these will give you some good ideas in your future pawn wars. And now, let me introduce to you something completely different. Something called the en passant. And that's a very special rule, only applies to pawns. In fact, it's a pretty tricky rule, so initially, maybe for the next couple of weeks, I suggest you perhaps practice chess without it, because it's quite complicated. But let me tell you about it anyway, so you just have it in the back of your mind, so you're familiar with all the different rules when it comes to pawns. It's a special situation when a pawn uses its special privilege to move 2 squares up instead of the normal one at a time. So when the pawn moves in this position to d5, and you do have a pawn on either side of the opposite color, that pawn can capture like this, taking off the black pawn off the board, just as if the pawn would have moved up only 1 square. And the other white pawn has that same opportunity as well. Of course, doing en passant is optional. You could also push a different pawn or move another piece later when you will play with all the pieces. But it's a special privilege that you only have at that very moment when your opponent moves the pawn up 2 squares. If you move one of your other pieces and you think about it, oh, let me do it on the following move, you cannot do that. Okay? So this is a once in a, not lifetime, but only at the moment when the pawn moves up 2 squares. Only then you can do it. Of course, if a different pawn moves up 2 squares, potentially you may have another opportunity on a different file. But when it comes to the black D pawn moving up, you can only do it on the very following move, if you happen to have a pawn on either side of the black pawn. Okay? And finally, let me point out that if black had a pawn on D6 and moved the pawn up only 1 square, then you do not have this option. Remember? So only if a pawn moved up 2 squares from its initial position, only then you have en passant. Pretty tricky, right? So it's up to you. You can try to play with the full game, but I don't mind if for the first few weeks you play without this special rule and then you go back to it and get ready for a full game. Have fun now that you know how to create a pass pawn and how to do a breakthrough so one of your pawns gets across quicker than your opponent. Thanks for listening. Welcome to lesson 4. Now we're going to learn about the rooks. So that's a major piece, a very valuable piece. It's worth 5 points. By the way, the pawns were worth only 1 point each, right? So the rook is 5 times as valuable than a pawn. The rook is a linear piece. It moves up and down or side to side. It doesn't jump around, it doesn't move on diagonals, it doesn't do a lot of things, but it just moves in straight lines, right? In any direction. And then it can come back, move in another direction. From here it could go to his b8, b3, f3, f6, and so on. Of course, your opponent will also keep making moves normally. Just to demonstrate it even better, imagine that these are just, let's say, pieces of buttons, right, that don't move around like not in a normal chess game your opponent would. So what would be the quickest way to pick up these little stones or buttons that pretends to be pawn right now? Right? So the order would be you capture this pawn first, then you capture this pawn first, and the next one, and the next one, and the next one. Right? So rooks are long-range pieces. They can move very quickly from one side of the board to another, right? And they are pretty powerful pieces, right? They are worth as much as 5 of the pawns together. So that's very important to know. Now, the other thing about rooks, that it simply captures as it moves. Unlike the pawns, right? The pawns were unique in that they move and capture differently. But the rooks, let's say there is a pawn here, let's say this rook is here, we have this position, the white rook now can just simply capture the enemy pawn. Of course, we can never ever capture our own pawns or any of our own pieces, right? We always typically aim to capture the opponent's pieces. It's not even our choice or option to ever capture our own pieces. And of course, the rook cannot jump over our own or the enemy piece. That's not allowed. Okay? So the rook can go as far as there is nothing in its way. Right? Just like moving normally, it can move in any direction, but not jumping over. You can capture this. Okay? Now, please continue listening on with our digital material and for the rest of the chapter.
Here we have the rook right in the middle of the board on d4, and you can see all the squares that the rook can move to from that d4 square shown with the green color. So the rook can move to any of those squares. Here we see a black rook on c6 that can move to all those squares. For example, this would be moving the rook to c2. Or, if we go back to our initial position, the rook would move to h6, right? And any of those other squares that you saw highlighted with green. Now, let's learn how the rook captures. Much easier than the pawn, it exactly captures the same way as it moves. Except, it cannot ever capture any of its own pieces, nor can it jump over it. Okay? So, right now you're seeing with yellow the 2 pieces that the rook can capture. You're seeing with green the other squares the rook can move to without capturing anything. And you do see with red the squares that the rook cannot move to because it cannot jump over any other piece, not your own piece and not your opponent's piece. Not just a pawn, but no piece whatsoever. Right? So a rook in such a situation, when there are pawns in its way, you cannot jump over. You can only go as far as you can capture a piece, but not beyond. And now let me show an interesting situation when, even though the rook is a lot more valuable piece than a pawn, or normally even 2 pawns, but it's not such a simple story. The rook is worth 5 points, remember? And each pawn is worth only 1. So the rook is worth 5 points. So let's play a game here where black is trying to make at least one of the pawns a queen to promote, and white's task is trying to prevent that. So let's try to see knowing that this pawn would like to advance to e2, but right now it is white's turn. So let's suppose we play rook to a2, so if that e pawn would advance, we could capture it. The problem is black will push the other pawn. And then, let's say we make this move, rook b2, black can advance either pawn because the other pawn protects it. We move down, so if the pawn would promote to a queen, the rook would capture that pawn. The problem is black will advance the other pawn and only promote either of the pawns at this stage when the other pawn from the side is ready to recapture and promote yet another queen. Let's go back to the beginning and let's see what would happen if we play rook to d1, attacking the pawn on d4. The problem is black would give up on that d4 pawn and would focus on the e pawn, and that would become a queen. Let's go back again. And interestingly, white has a good move here, and that is to move the rook to e1. Even though we are not really threatening to capture that pawn right now, because the d4 pawn is protecting it. However, as soon as the d pawn moves forward, then already we can capture, and after d2, move behind the pawn, be just in time when the pawn promotes to capture it. And alternatively, if rook e1, black pushes the other pawn, we would just capture it. So, this is the short story of the rook. Hope you remember this and can play a more fun game, now not just with pawns, but also with the rooks included.